Hi all, welcome to this new episode of my podcast, A Digital Tomorrow. Today I'm joined by Her Excellency Serey Chea, Director General of the National Bank of Cambodia. Serey, welcome to my show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure to host you today. And well, I think the best way for us to start would be to talk about the National Bank of Cambodia. So if you could please tell our listeners a bit about the NBC, like for example, when was it created, what are its main objectives, and anything else you want to share.
Yeah, sure. So the National Bank of Cambodia is the central bank of Cambodia, and we were first created or established in 1953, right after our independence from France. Um, but then in 1975, we had a civil war and the central bank was bombarded, destroyed to the ground, and the whole monetary system was actually abolished. So for about 3.5 years, uh, the whole country was back to a barter system, and this is the first case in any contemporary history where the monetary system is abolished. Um, because it's symbol of capitalism, because the leader then Pol Pot has a very idealistic utopia that he wanted to create, where you bring everyone back into farming and create this societies where there's no rich and poor, and so for 3.5 years we didn't have a central bank, but then in 79, when the war or this regime was over, we re-established the central bank again, and we're celebrating our 41st anniversary this year. So it fulfilled the function of a central bank. We conduct monetary policy. We oversee commercial banks or the banking system, but we also oversee the payment system in the country.
Mhm. I see. Thank you very much for sharing the National Bank of Cambodia's history, and I think today there are like two main topics about which I would like to talk. One of them is, of course, Project Bakong, and the other one is digitalization and fintech in general in Cambodia. I'm going to start with Project Bakong because I remember that back in, I think it was October 2020, pretty much when the Bahamas launched their Sun Dollar and people started to talk a lot about the digital yuan in China. People also talked a lot about Project Bakong, even though, as far as I know, we shouldn't refer to it as a CBDC, but well, I'm going to let you answer that. So do you think that we should refer to Project Bakong as a CBDC, or rather a payment and money transfer service?
As far as we are concerned, it is a backbone payment system. And I think one of the reasons where people call it CBDC, and I have to admit it, there are some elements of CBDC, but it's not a CBDC in its sort of complete definition. Um, One is the fact that this is something that is introduced by the central banks, that it used blockchain technology. So I think just with these two elements, it's very easy for people to jump to conclusion that it is a CBDC. But for as far as Bakong is concerned, we don't create any additional money supply. So it's not really issuance of currency. It's merely an exchange of fiat money against a digital form of money. And that digital form, we use blockchain technology, the distributed ledger Hyperledger Iroha. We also don't just issue it in Khmer Real, what we also issue it in US dollar. So it's even less likely to be a CBDC because we also issue it in a foreign currency. So for us, it's we don't really consider it as such, but we do understand again about this element where it can give to confusion. There's also element of immediate finality. So the peer-to-peer aspect to it is also another reason to think of it as a CBDC.
I see. Maybe I should have started from the very beginning before digging deeper into Bakong. But why is Bakong such a groundbreaking initiative? What are the main results that you obtained from it? Because, well, I mean, I know that the name Bakong may sound familiar to many people, even though they are not working in finance, because as far as I remember, it's one of the temples in Angkor, in Siem Reap. But when it comes to your Bakong project, why is it so groundbreaking? What did you obtain from it? Is there any next phase to this project?
So first, what were the intention behind Bakong, right? And the intention really wasn't to create a central bank digital currency, because at the time when we started to studies about blockchain technology, the concept of CBDC wasn't even there yet. I mean, it was vaguely mentioned, but it wasn't really something that people would take on seriously. But at that time, the concept of cryptocurrency was everywhere, the peak of Bitcoin. So we started studying the technology in 2017. And the reason we started all this was what we wanted to do was to create interoperability among the different players in the country. So in Cambodia, we have the commercial banks, we have the payment service provider, and each individual institution has their own mobile payment, and each of them would exist on a solo basis, right? They can't talk to each other. So if I am a customer of Bank A and I want to transfer money to my friends who are a customer of Bank B, I can't do that, right? And so it make payment transaction very inconvenient and very difficult. So in our case, there is also a divide between those who use banks. So mostly more affluent people, urban people who would open a bank account and they use it. And then you've got another segment of the population which are less affluent, obviously, in the rural area, or they would normally go for a mobile wallet that is provided by what we call payment service provider. And so by having these two industries not talking to each other, you are also creating a social divide, right, between the rich and the urban and the poor and the rural. And so that wasn't something that we wanted to see as the central banks. Beyond making payment easy, we want to also bridge these two together. And so this where the first intention came. And so we wanted to create this interoperability. And at that time, we were exploring different technology where we could do this. Now, the first very conventional technology that we could use was the regular centralized system, which is exactly what we've been doing with banks currently, where and central banks everywhere in the world have similar sort of mechanism, where you have commercial banks opening a settlement account with the central bank. And whenever I, as a customer, I want to transfer money, But over the counter, I'll go to over the counter and I tell the bank I want to transfer money to my friend who is a customer of Bank B. The bank would then do its own, back end processing, and then they would send a message to the central bank and say, credit Bank B this much, and then with the instructions that this much is for customer, I don't know, Mr. John or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the central bank is actually the centralized entity, and we will manage the money in the settlement account of each bank to make sure that banks have enough money to settle its obligation if it arises, right? So that's the conventional way of doing cross or interbank settlement. You follow me up to here, right?
Yes, indeed.
Now we could do the same with payment service provider, and we could say, okay, now payment service provider, which we currently regulate as at a much lesser sort of a stringency than banks, and obviously so because they don't take deposit. We could do the same with the payment service provider and say, look, you can now transfer money to your customer can now transfer money to other customers from other banks, but you have to be a member of the clearinghouse, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can come and open a bank account at the clearinghouse and make sure you manage the liquidity properly and so on and so forth. Now, when we look from that perspective, as far as the National Bank of Cambodia is concerned, we felt that it would be too burdensome to have the payment service provider to come and open a settlement account with the central bank and manage their liquidity. And the reason is because when you add on this, you add also the regulatory compliance cost to this payment service provider. And ultimately, this cost will be passing on to their customer, which is then, against our intention in the first place to regulate them, at a lesser sort of stringency than banks. So by calling them to join the clearinghouse, we're adding on more compliance costs to them, and it wasn't something that we wanted, and would probably be counterproductive. And so that's where the technology, distributed ledger, and the peer-to-peer feature of it really makes sense for us. And so we start looking at the peer-to-peer. And so what we did with Bakong is completely, I would say, innovative in a way that because we haven't seen it done elsewhere. We will say, look, now we can bring everyone onto everyone to speak the same language. But first, you become a member of Bakong, meaning you integrate your system with the Bakong system. And then for payment service provider, all they need to do is they exchange their fiat money with the central bank. So they surrender their money to us, and we credit the digital form of it to the payment service provider. So it's a one-to-one exchange, right? And once the payment service provider has this, they can then distribute this digital form of money to their end user. And when they do that, the payment service provider don't have to worry about managing their settlement account, because when they distribute to their end users, their end user can only send when they have money in their own wallet, because it's peer-to-peer. If they don't have money, then they can't transfer. So the PSP, the payment service provider, don't even have to worry, how much they should hold. They will give to their end user whatever the end user need, and the end user can only send what they have. And the end user can send to anyone else who has a Bakong wallet or whose bank are member of the Bakong system. And they will receive it peer-to-peers. And so far we have about 25, 26 members, and we have 25 more waiting to integrate their system. So altogether we have almost 90% of the banking industry and payment service industry into the Bakong system. And so this then now allow people to send money to anyone much easier than before. So that's the backbone sort of payment part of Bakong. But Bakongs also come as in the form of wallet. So there is a universal app that the central bank introduced, where anyone in the country with a mobile phone, a local mobile phone, can download, register themselves with any member banks in Bakong, and with a photo of their national ID and a selfie, and the Bakong engine will do a matching between the photo and the selfie. Once it's matched, then also first with this is tier KYC. If you have a phone number and nothing else, you are allowed to transact up to $500.
Okay.
And this is very powerful from a financial inclusion perspective, because a lot of the people in the rural area or low income, they may not have proper documentation in place, right? And so we think that with $500 limit per day is more than enough for them, given the level of their living standards. So it would allow them to easily participate in the formal system without too much constraint. And this is also relying on the telco regulator to impose certain KYC when people acquire the telephone number. And then on the second tier of this KYC is the ID and the selfie. Then your limit will increase a bit more. And then on the third tier, you will actually have to be at a bank branch to register themselves, answer a few questions. Then your limit will be then increased. So by creating tier KYC, anyone can be a member of Bakong without too much constraint, and therefore encouraging people to be part of the ecosystem, encouraging people to use these electronic ways of making payment. And ultimately, once you're into the system, you would have a sort of a digital footprint that follow you. And so your payment, your receipt, etc., would be visible to the banks that you registered yourself with. And that then could enable bank to have a better clarity as to who you are and what your cash flow, and also if you want to request for a loan, then it's easier for them to make decision because they know you better.
I see.
So yeah.
No, thank you very much for. Please go ahead.
No, so in summary, there are actually two aspects to Bakong. One is the backbone payment system, where we act as a kind of centralized engine and connecting everyone to each other using the peer-to-peer feature of the technology to enable everyone to be part of it. Second, Bakong is also in itself a digital wallet, but it's not a digital wallet that is, so the wallet is issued by the central bank because we are the one who are the technology provider. Of course, with partnership with our partnership, the Japanese Tsuramitsu company, but the money inside the wallet is guaranteed by the banks with whom the customer has selected to be a customer of.
Well, thanks for this explanation on Bakong. It's actually fascinating to hear that. And I was going to ask you before about blockchain technology, but you pretty much summarized everything about how the technology behind the Bakong works. So, well, thanks for that. And you mentioned as well a very interesting point about which I'm very keen on learning more, which is financial inclusion. As part of my work at the Global Impact FinTech Group, basically I try to work on ways to promote financial inclusion. And well, as you said before, Bakong might be an effective tool for Cambodian people, especially in rural areas, to become included in your financial system. So I wanted to ask you whether you have any stats about what's, for example, the mobile phone penetration in Cambodia, and more importantly, what's the percentage of unbanked people in Cambodia?
So in terms of the mobile phone penetration, and that's one of the reasons why we decided to work on Bakong as well, is that we have a population about 16.5 million, and our mobile phone subscription is about 22 million. So there's a very high penetrations of mobile phone. The only sort of caveat on this is that not all the 22 million subscriptions are on a smartphone basis, right? So some are still using feature phone, which is which won't be able to support Bakong technology. That's we're very aware, but increasingly more and more smartphone are adopted because of the lower cost. Internet access is another infrastructure that we can't neglect when we want to digitalize anything. And so in terms of internet access, the latest data that I got is that about 60 to 70% of the population have access to internet. And we have just now, in terms of having access to finance, 70% of the population have access to one form of formal financial services. So we count as formal financial services is either have a credit with a financial institution, a loan with a financial institution, a deposit account, or an e-wallet account, or an insurance policy. So if you have either one of these, we consider that you are included. And the statistic that we have currently is about 70%. But of the 70%, about 45% now actually has a deposit account, a saving account, which we think this is a very important element to financial inclusions, is to encourage people to have a proper saving account as well. So these are, you know, the things that we are working to achieve, which to, you know, increase this inclusion rate even further, and especially having people to access, you know, the right financial services that would serve their needs.
Well, I mean, we're talking about a very high smartphone and internet penetration, so I guess that's why Bakong could be such a success as well. And I think that what Bakong proves is something that I say, but I normally say it from a more theoretical perspective, and it's that, I mean, in that case I talk about CBDCs, but since Bakong has some similarities with CBDCs, I think the same idea could be applicable, no? And I always say that CBDCs can be a very effective tool when promoting financial inclusion. So I think that Bakong could be a practical example of a successful project, even though, as you said before, it's not exactly a CBDC, but it's a quasi maybe CBDC in most aspects. And I wanted to tell you now about well, the US dollar and your local currency, the riel, because I remember last time I went to Cambodia, I think it was back in 2017. I remember that many people paid in US dollars rather than using your local currency. So do you think that Bakong has to some extent increased the use of the riel, your Cambodian local currency? Or do you think that in the future it may help Cambodia switch from a US dollar-based economy to a riel-based one, or it will have no effect whatsoever in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that the Cambodia's economy is very heavily dollarized. About, I think, 85 to 90% of our economic transactions are done in US dollar. It's a very tiny amount, obviously, the remaining in local currency. Now, oftentimes people put a lot of expectations on Bakong, but I think to promote the use of local currency, Bakong alone won't achieve anything, right? And we need, stability of the local currency, right? That's something that on a macro prudential level, we'll try to manage maintaining stability of our exchange rate, trying our best to maintain to keep the inflation rate very low. So these are the fundamental that is needed. What Bakong is going to do is to make transaction in local currency more convenient. Now, the thing with dollarization in Cambodia is that it wasn't a deliberate decision from the government. It was kind of accidental.
Mm-hmm.
And if I give you a bit of history, that's also very interesting, is that Cambodia, you visited Angkor Wat, right?
Yes.
Cambodia used to be, one of the biggest kingdom in the region, and in its time, the 12th century, probably also one of the most populated in the world, right? Angkor Wat, housed about 2 million people in the 12th century when London or Paris was had about 100,000 population. That's really massive in comparison. But interestingly, when we dig a bit deeper into this civilization, is that at the peak of this civilization, very sophisticated in terms of infrastructure, irrigation system, etc., architecture, and so on, we didn't have a monetary system. Right? We
Mm-hmm.
didn't have money. People in the kingdom was using barter, and we found this in the carvings on the walls of temples, where a lot of the descriptions about tax payment, donation, etc., are done with cattle or harvest that people uh, get. And so in a way, Cambodia, for a very long time, Cambodian monetary history has been very, very short. And then from the 12th century onwards, the only time and then the first time we had our real sort of monetary system was towards the end of the 19th century, when the French came to colonize, or rather, we were a protectorate of France. And we had then probably one of the first monetary union in the world. So countries, Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were using the same currency back then, right? And then 1953, the French withdraw and we had independence. We were no longer using this currency. Our king introduced another currency. It was abolished in 75. No money again, back to the barter system.
I see.
And then after this regime, we then had a currency, but then it was very weak because the country was still in civil war, right? And then when in 1992, when we had our first general election, the local currency just crumbled. It's depreciated uh, to almost nothing. And so when US dollar came in through the what we call the UN transition administration force, they brought in US dollar and they were freely using US dollar in the country, and that's when people starting to adopt this US dollar. It's like an adopted kid, but then now the adopted kid is more loved than the own kids, right? And and so giving this history of money in Cambodia, it was very interesting for me in particular to see that this is a country who has very little history of money. People
Mm-hmm.
are not familiar with the local currency as much because they never actually used it. And the short period that they used it, there's a lot of, hiccup and hurdles in between, with wars and depreciations and high inflation, etc. And now I'm working in one of, from being used to a barter system and now using one of the most sophisticated form of money, which is, the digital money. For me, it's really a big contrast. So when people ask me whether, will Bakong would help really promote local currency, I said yes, it will, because it will make transactions in local currency more convenient. So
Mm-hmm.
people, rather than carrying, loads of banknotes, they can do it digitally now. But it won't be the only thing that is needed. What is needed is other macro conditions I mentioned to you, which is stable currency, economic growth. People have to have confidence in the local currency for them to use. But Bakong is a mean to an end. It's not an end itself. So back to your question, yes, it will help. We have seen increased usage of digital payment in local currency. In Bakong, we have about, now interestingly, only 20% of the transaction in Bakong is done in local currency. The other 80% are still in US dollar, but the number is increasing, which is very encouraging for us, because more and more people now are using electronic payment as a mean to pay, because of COVID restrictions. I mean the trying to minimize contact, etc., because of the pandemic.
Indeed.
Um, Adoptions of e-payment become it's become natural for people to adopt all this, and so if this continue to increase, and if the 20 to 80 is at, if at least it's maintained that proportions, but we hope that it will increase. It's already good. As I told you initially, there's only about 90%, 85, from 85 to 90% of transactions are in US dollar. But now in Bakong, we already see 20%, and we see the trend increasing. So we hope that we would increase adoptions of local currency, at least in the digital, in the electronic payment platform, and eventually will translate into other bigger transaction in the economy, bigger value transaction.
I like very much this idea that Bakong is a mean to an end, and everything you told me now about the real and the US dollar. And given that we are almost running out of time, before finishing, I would like to briefly ask you about cryptocurrencies, because, well, undoubtedly, technically speaking, Bakong adopted blockchain and some ideas, I guess, from the crypto world, but it doesn't mean, though, that that Cambodia as a country or your central bank necessarily supports crypto. So I wanted to ask you what's the National Bank of Cambodia's view on cryptocurrencies. Do you think they have a role in the future of payments, or on the other hand, do you think they are way too volatile and risky?
Well, I think as a matter of principle, I mean, the people who's behind the crypto, they have, it was well meant, right? It was to help, eliminate intermediaries, allow people to transfer assets or values easily to each other without having to pay, big amount of commissions and fees to financial institutions. The problem with it is that it has growing out of proportions. There are so many types, there are so many issuers, you don't know who is doing what, and the value, as you can see recently, fluctuates like nobody business. So from a central bank perspective, where our job is to make sure that consumer interests are protected, we don't know how to protect them with this, right? It's almost like a gambling platform in a way, where you can buy crypto at your own risk. So that's probably the stance that we have right now, but we do not allow banks to get involved. in the cash out of crypto, or even in indirectly, because we don't want people to be seen as seen it as, we don't want banks to see it as an encouragement for them to get involved in cryptocurrency, because people, it's depend on the type of investor. I know Cambodians are investors, or we're not sophisticated enough to understand all this, right? They think that this is an investment, like you buy stock in stock markets, and then you sit and you wait until you get your coupon or whatsoever. It doesn't work like this. This is
Yeah,
like
it's a bit different,
like
yes.
it's if you're lucky, right, you will sell it at the right time and you make money. If you're not, then it would, your investment can come down to zero, and that is something that, unless people are well educated about the risk, then I don't think we should encourage them to invest in these instruments. But again, I know it is well intended, but it's just that there are very little rules now in Cambodia, and I think for us it's not something that is urgent for us to come up with the rules and allow it to happen. We don't feel that people should, at least for now, should look into this kind of investment. There's so much more to do. There's so much more to invest in SMEs and all this, rather than put your money into a platform and you don't know what people who get your money is doing with it, right? That's even serious, and it's not productive for the economy.
Well, thank you very much for sharing all that with me. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we need to conclude our discussion now. It's been a pleasure, Her Excellency Serey Chea, to host you today, to learn so much from you about Bakong, about Cambodia's view on cryptocurrencies and so many things. So thank you very much for accepting my invitation. It's been an absolute honor.
Thank you.